Hey everybody, this is Carlos Velez from Lacerta Bio in New York, bringing you our annual Year in Review 2024 edition. And this time we're going to start, we're going to start where we always start, and that's with the FDA approvals for this past year. Um, I would say, in general, it's been a solid year. We'll probably finish the year in the 45 ish approvals. Um, I say this every year. When you have a moment, do take a look at the approvals for the year. The link is there in the lower left hand corner. It's always interesting to me, at least, to see the kinds of drugs that are approved. Many are for indications that perhaps we've never even heard of, from companies we've never heard of. So it always makes for interesting reading. This year's list includes a few antibiotics, which is interesting, an antihypertensive or two, and the usual, some for rare disease, some oncology, and so forth. So do take a look. I think it's been a good year for the FDA, and we'll come back to that, the FDA performance issue in a moment. Some of the ones that we thought were interesting, Cobenfy, with some old-timey pharmacology here for a new product for the treatment of schizophrenia by BMS. I don't remember the last time something was approved for schizophrenia. Um, if somebody could remind me, but my gut is that it's been a long time since we've seen something for schizophrenia, which is great to see, obviously. Ojemda, which is interesting because it's for admittedly a subtype of the gliomas, but gliomas are inherently very difficult to treat. So anything that can treat, at least one subpopulation is always welcome. This was also approved or developed by a company called Day One Biopharmaceuticals. I've said this many times. I think the more commercial stage companies we have in the industry, the better. And so hat tip to the folks at Day One. And thirdly, Kinsula, donanemab was finally approved. This is from Lilly. We've talked about Alzheimer's. We talked about it in last year's video. Again, it's always great to see new therapies for very difficult to treat patient populations like Alzheimer's. So again, it's a welcome addition to the treatment armamentarium. But it brings back in my mind the question that I asked last year, and I'm still asking, which is it still getting more difficult to get drugs approved? Now, this is data from an IQVIA 2024 report. I have this report in my files. If you're interested, let me know. I'll be happy to send it to you. But if you look at the lower left-hand corner, this is likelihood of approval. So this is essentially the probability of a drug candidate getting from phase 1 through phase 2, from phase 2 to phase 3, then through regulatory and eventually approval. And what you'll see is that in 2025, we were in the 20 to 25% likelihood of approval range. That dropped a lot in the 2020s, 2016, 2017. It dropped quite a bit. Last year was a little bit better, and you'll see the data in the upper right where we look at the probability of success for various stages of development. So probability of success would be the probability of successfully getting from phase 1 into phase 2, from phase 2 into phase 3, and so forth. And you see all the lines drop from 2015 down to about 2020, 2021, and they begin to pick up with the exception of phase 1. So, with the exception of phase 2. So, we are improving to some degree. I think it's perfectly fine to have, a higher degree of failure in phase 2, given that phase 2 is typically more for sort of exploratory studies anyway. So, things are getting better from a development point of view, but we're certainly nowhere near as an industry where we used to be. Now, there are, some very valid reasons for this. We continue to choose to do things that are very difficult. Even the small molecules these days are not the small molecules that we were developing 20, 30 years ago. They're much larger. They're much more complex. They're trying to hit targets that are, in some cases novel, unvalidated, and so forth. That's even before we get to cell and gene therapy and other more complex modalities. So the fact that these probabilities of success and likelihoods of approval are lower compared to what they used to be. When you think about it, it's probably not terribly surprising, but it's good to see some improvement. That's for sure. I think that's good news. It also looks like we're getting a bit better at working with the regulators on these more complex modalities, which again is always great to see. It's always a good trend when you have improvements like this. But there was some discussion on LinkedIn and other sources, and other places about this question, which is whether or not management in our industry is the problem. And the question has been posed is why are we not getting better at drug development? So one reason is that because we're trying to do things that are more difficult. The other argument is that yes, that's true, but it's also that we have industry management that no matter how good they are or no matter how good they have been, it simply doesn't mean that previous drug development success will lead to future drug delivery success, simply because what we're trying to do is so difficult. So there are a couple of articles, you have the links there. There's some discussion on LinkedIn as well about whether or not management is quote unquote the problem. My personal opinion, it's not that management is the problem. I think the issue is that no matter how good management has been in the past, when that management team is tasked to doing something very, very difficult, at least from a biological, from a chemistry point of view and so forth, it's just hard. We're just doing things that are really, really difficult to do, irrespective of who's in charge. So check out those articles. There's some more discussion online about the influence of successful management on drug development. And while I was looking at the IQVIA data, I came across this report, which I frankly was not aware of. But if you look at this IQVIA report, this was a report looking at exclusions by payers in the U.S. for cancer drugs. And if you look at the first bullet point, this is the one that kind of struck me. It's basically what IQVIA found is that roughly 50% of Medicare patients who experience a payer rejection never, and that's my emphasis, never initiate therapy. These are cancer drugs. Imagine a cancer patient that receives a prescription, it gets rejected by the payer, and they decide not to initiate therapy. I mean, that to me is absolutely incredible. These are not drugs to treat, alopecia, male pattern baldness. This is cancer, and we see the exclusions increasing over time. Which, again, why this is happening and so forth. I mean, we can, that's probably a topic for another video. But one thing that strikes me is that the likelihood of approval, like we talked about a couple of slides ago, and the likelihood of reimbursement are frankly two different things. We don't think, well, I'll speak for myself. We as an industry, as a consultant, probably don't think about the likelihood of reimbursement as often as we should. And I will concede that that's something that's very, very difficult to predict. It's not that unusual for companies to have payer interviews during drug development. They're not cheap. They're not definitive. Until an official documents are filed with the payers. It's difficult to project whether something will be reimbursed or not. But still, this is not a good trend for the industry. That's for sure. And while I was looking into this, I came across this paper, which was published in 2023. You see the link there. This was an interesting study. What this group did was they identified roughly 50 products that were approved in the U.S., but not and approved in other countries. In this case, Australia, Canada, and the U.K. Approved in those countries, but are not being reimbursed. They received a negative reimbursement recommendation. And so if you look at the paper, how it turns out is that a lot, in some cases, 20+% of products that are approved in the U.S. and approved in these countries are not reimbursed. Now, what's the median cost of those products that are not being reimbursed in these countries? It's over $100,000 a year. So in some cases, there are products that are being approved in the U.S., approved ex-U.S., but are not being reimbursed ex-U.S. simply because of the high price. Now, what can the industry do about this? What the incoming administration do about this? I'm not entirely sure, but it clearly has, again, looking at it from a sort of business development point of view, it has tremendous valuation implications. If I think I'm going to be developing something that's going to be so expensive in the US that it won't be approved ex-US, you know, it's very easy at that point for a valuation model simply to collapse if I have no ex-US market simply because of reimbursement issues. So, again, this is not a good trend for the industry. Whether this will change over time, we'll simply have to wait and see. And speaking of bad ideas, let's talk about the IRA. The IRA it's still around. The first hit list, the hit list. I don't remember who came up with the word hit list. It was either Peter Kolchinsky from RA or Bruce Booth from Atlas. I don't remember. If somebody knows and can tell me, let me know. But the hit list, the prices have been set. This is as of September of this year. The hit list has been expanded. If you're not aware of some of the problems with the IRA, there's an article there which I recommend reading to understand some of the issues with the IRA in terms of small molecule versus biologics and so forth. Now, what the incoming administration will do about this, if anything, is incredibly hard to predict. I do think it's a good opportunity to fix some of these issues. And look, to be clear, I'm all for, a government payer having the opportunity to negotiate pricing with sponsors. I mean, that's something that's done in most other parts of the world. Why not here? No, nothing wrong with that. But let's recognize that the way the IRA is currently formed or formulated, it has its issues. So whether the incoming administration will do anything about that, we'll just have to wait and see. We'll come up back to this point in a moment. Next topic. Show me the money. Licensing volume this year looks like will be down relative to previous years. These data came from a very good Locust Walk report. Now, I will concede that gathering data on licenses can be difficult. Press releases are sometimes vague. They're not always released on time. So we'll see where we wind up. In terms of activity in 2024, we'll see what the final data look like. We'll probably see some of that data, in early January. But it stands to reason that it'll probably be a down year relative to previous years. Now, the past 2 years have been highly transactive. There is perhaps some assimilation taking place at this point. We'll just have to wait and see where the final numbers land. But it's good to see that there's still a lot of very early stage licensing taking place. Depending on which data source you look at, something on the order of 50, 60+% of licenses are for candidates that are at the discovery or preclinical stage, plus quite a few at phase 1, which sometimes surprises people who think that you have to have phase 2 data. And you do have to have phase 2 data in some therapeutic areas for some indications, for some modalities that may be true. But there's still a lot of very early stage licensing taking place, and that hasn't changed really since probably 2021 is when we start seeing a lot more very early stage licensing. So that trend, although I don't have the data here, is still proceeding. But I think we'll have a down year from a licensing perspective. From an investment perspective, I think the trend that we've seen over the past few years will be exactly the same for 2024. We're seeing roughly 10 billion-ish being invested in seed and Series A rounds. That money is going into fewer and fewer rounds. So, while the investment dollars are remaining the same, the number of companies receiving that capital is decreasing. So there's more money going into fewer companies, which obviously makes it challenging from a fundraising perspective. The IPO markets are essentially closed. They remain closed. The tourist investors that came in around COVID are largely gone. Whether they will start coming back is a topic that we will discuss in a few minutes. But it looks like 2025. I think will still be a challenging year from a fundraising perspective. This is some data that I saw in the Nature Biotechnology article. You see the reference there. Investments in cell and gene therapy. I was not aware of this, and they have just fallen off a cliff, since 2021. Very, very few rounds, very, very few investments taking place in cell and gene therapy these days. And look, in hindsight, perhaps it's for obvious reasons. We have a lot of safety issues. We have CMC issues. We have pricing issues. We're seeing some big pharma companies exit cell and gene therapy entirely. Whether this will turn around in the near term, I don't know, which is really unfortunate, because if some of the safety and CMC issues can be sorted out, these are some amazing therapies. I mean, the thought of curing, some of the leukemias, for example, was something that would be, frankly, unthinkable, even as soon as recently as 10, 15 years ago. The fact that we're able to achieve cures for some of these diseases is frankly incredible and remarkable. We will see what the incoming administration can do about this, and again, we'll come to that point in a few minutes. So while cell and gene therapy investments are declining, AI investments are also declining, perhaps leveling off to some degree. There was a bit of an investment boom in 2020, 2021, and 2022. That has dropped. Interestingly, AI is beginning to attract, tech investors from outside of biotech. I'm not entirely convinced that's a good thing, but we'll just have to wait and see. I have met with AI companies several times over the past few years. They have a tendency to struggle, oftentimes, with strategy. Is an AI company a service provider? Are they a company that's trying to discover and develop novel drug candidates? Do they do both simultaneously? Are some investors interested in one business model versus another? I mean, these are challenging questions. They're not unique to AI. The drug delivery companies, 25 years ago had similar questions. And there are no easy solutions. Obviously, it takes a bit of luck and a bit of advanced technology to be able to execute on the drug discovery business model. But you have to pay the bills somehow. So, having both business models running in parallel is sort of an obvious way to do this. But it's a challenge. It's a struggle. Whether we'll see, more investments going to AI, we'll just have to wait and see. I suspect that, the big pharma companies, the CROs, the CDMOs will just continue to incorporate AI into their own, internal discovery efforts, and a lot of these service-based AI companies will probably either get acquired or simply just fall by the wayside if they're not able to execute either one of these strategies. Which leads me to a couple of other issues regarding AI that I've discussed and thought about this past year. One is a term I just learned a few weeks ago, which is the term multifluency. Multifluency essentially means the ability to speak different languages, and in the AI context, what that means is in artificial intelligence drug discovery companies, you have to have people that can speak, let's say, the language of the medicinal chemist and the language of the computational chemist, and so having people that can sort of span both, let's say, traditional drug discovery and, let's say, computational drug discovery. Those people are well trained, but it also means that they're rare, they're hard to find, and they're very expensive. These are people that are very skilled, very talented, and they're hard to come by, and they're expensive. So finding those people, especially if you want to find many people that have those qualifications, those skills, makes it difficult for companies that are interested in pursuing the AI drug discovery model. Which leads to the next point, which is the GIGO problem. One of the theoretical benefits of artificial intelligence is that you can use, let's say, old legacy data as training data to discover, perhaps novel targets, novel hit matter, and so forth. But that statement assumes that the legacy data is compatible with artificial intelligence modules, that it can be formatted in the right way, that it can be read in the right way, that it can be translated in the right way. And that may or may not be the case. And apparently, there are some companies that are struggling with this very issue. The companies that have a lot of potentially useful, let's call it legacy data, but the data can't be read. And the data has to be, it requires a lot of effort to reformat and to translate those data into a format that can be correctly interpreted by the AI models. Now, look, I'm not an expert in this. I don't know entirely what I'm talking about when I say these things, but apparently, from what I've read and from what others have told me, it's a problem, especially when it comes to trying to explore, let's say, new chemical space for looking for completely new, non-obvious drug candidates. Which also leads to another point, which has been discussed this past year, is the issue of facilities. Somebody had an interesting thought. What if we had an old, old being a relative term, what if we have an old laboratory? What if we took that lab, and if we're converting to AI drug discovery, what if we take that lab and convert it to a server farm? Put some servers in there, put some cooling systems in there, put the computational people in the building, and completely transform it from a traditional bench and hood type situation over to a server farm. How much would that cost? Would it be cheaper simply to just rip that building down and build a new one from scratch? I don't know. But these are challenges that, a lot of companies, both large and small, especially larger companies, are struggling with when it comes to artificial intelligence. I suspect these are issues that will be addressed over time. I think the benefits of AI make it worthwhile to accept some of these challenges. So we'll see what happens in the years to come. Next, let's talk about the presidentials. To be completely fair, I'm recording this. It is second week in December. The new administration doesn't take over until 6-7 weeks from now, 5-6 weeks from now. So it's really difficult to say with any degree of certainty what the administration is going to do precisely. It's difficult to say how those changes, if they take place, will impact the industry. So, if you're looking for sort of definitive, steps and action items to take place in 2025, well, you've probably come to the wrong place. But here's a couple of things that we've been thinking about the past few weeks. T for tariffs. There's been a lot of talk about tariffs, putting tariffs on things imported from China, Canada, and Mexico. How that'll impact the industry, who knows? Whether it'll impact, the importation of raw materials from China, whether it'll impact, CROs, CDMOs that we're working with in China, devices, components. I have absolutely no idea. We'll just have to wait and see what these tariffs look like, how big they are, what the impact will be on the purchasers of these supplies coming in from China. So it's just something we'll have to keep an eye on. Second, RFK Jr. These are people that have been nominated. They have to go through a congressional approval process. I'm assuming that Congress will just go ahead and approve these nominations. Look, RFK has, let's just say he's made some controversial statements around vaccines and food and so forth. One thought that has been circulated around is the idea that RFK will likely be more focused on food than on pharma. If that's the case, then perhaps there won't be as much of a change in how the FDA operates, at least in the near term. But I'll come back to that point in a moment. U for uninsured. What's going to happen to the IRA? What's going to happen to Obamacare? Again, difficult to predict. There is some talk about people who want to eliminate Obamacare, not realizing that Obamacare is the ACA. If you're not familiar with the ACA, just look it up. There's plenty of information out there. Obviously having a growing percentage of the population that's underinsured or uninsured makes it a problem for us as an industry. We'll just have to wait and see how this evolves. M for markets. Look, anything that's considered, pro pharma will be, immediately reflected in the stock prices of the big pharma companies. Whether these changes that are coming will impact, the private investors, the LPs investing in new venture funds and so forth. Your guess is as good as mine, quite frankly. Um, and then P for pharma. What do these things mean for the industry? I have no idea. I think things that are pro-inflationary, tariffs, immigration, and so forth, that's going to be a problem, especially when it comes to inflation and interest rates, and it is potentially negative impact on investments in biotech. Um, there are opportunities to change course here in a couple of places. There are opportunities here to fix the IRA. There may be opportunities to change what happens in the Federal Trade Commission. I'm specifically thinking about the Sanofi Maze therapeutic situation. Um, we'll just have to we'll just have to wait and see. I hate to repeat myself, but there it is. One potential problem for pharma is the impact of the unelected. Yes, I agree that there may be opportunities to identify inefficiencies in the federal government. There may be inefficiencies that may result in safely reducing spending, which is obviously always a good thing. But there has been some talk already about cutting budgets at the FDA, which, again, if it's done intelligently, it's something that we in general would be in favor of. But, my concern from an industry point of view is that budget cuts at the FDA will mean slower approvals, slower time to inspections of manufacturing facilities, a more difficult time to schedule meetings because there's understaffing and so forth. So, what the unelected decide to do with the FDA budget, the NIH budget, and so forth, again, we'll just have to see. It's something that could be potentially an issue for us as an industry. But a lot of this has to go through Congress, and so whether Congress will simply just rubber stamp, or whether they will rebel to some degree, we'll have to see. Which leads me to my next slide. The incoming administration has talked about making changes to government spending which will favor cures. That's my quote, cures over lifestyle and maintenance type drugs. So policies that would favor, let's say, cell and gene therapies at the expense of things that would be for the treatment of, let's say, obesity or male pattern baldness and so forth. We'll have to see how that all plays out. What this means for vaccinations, whether it's childhood vaccinations, vaccinations for flu, pneumonia, COVID, and so forth, we will just have to see. There has been some talk about restricting direct-to-consumer advertising. In my opinion, that's just going to be a non-starter. The industry and their well-paid attorneys will fight that tooth and nail. And look, the reason why there is advertising for drug products on television is because the advertising works. Otherwise, Big Pharma wouldn't be spending money. We wouldn't be seeing all these ads for, all the drugs all the injectables to treat psoriasis. So I think that's a non-starter. I don't think we're going to see, reduction in direct-to-consumer advertising. Not as long as there are lawyers to fight that. And again, like we talked about a few minutes ago about favoring cures, that may be implemented via changes in what the NIH funds, where the money from SBIR, STTR grants go to. That we maybe see increased funding for companies developing rare diseases, cell and gene therapies, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, that might be a good thing. We'll just have to wait and see. A few other things from this year. The obesity market. Yeah, we talked about the obesity market last year. I'm not sure what else to add. I did post something on LinkedIn regarding some Amgen clinical results, which look quite good, to be candid. some interpreted it as a pot shot, as a criticism of Amgen, which it's not. It really wasn't intended to be a criticism of Amgen. I do think as an industry, we're just spending tremendous amount of capital and time on obesity drug candidates when perhaps that capital, those resources, can be spent better on other areas, other indications that are quite frankly being ignored by the industry. So I think we as an industry, I mean, I get it. I understand why companies want to pursue, product opportunities in obesity. Rationally speaking, it makes a great deal of sense. I just continue to believe that we as an industry can do better in terms of how we allocate our resources. The other thing I'll say about obesity is that the movement towards oral therapies is quite interesting. We have seen other examples in our industry where a change of modality, a change of mechanism of action has completely changed how a disease has been treated. Psoriasis is one example. Crohn's disease is another example. So the shift away from the auto-injector towards oral, could be a massive change in how obesity is being treated. So we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see if we experience that type of shift as we've seen in the past. Artificial intelligence. The one thing I didn't mention earlier, and there has been some discussion about this, is the question as to whether we're using training data that is so biased towards safe, effective drugs that we're not sort of pushing the boundaries of drug discovery because we're so concerned about discovering something that is potentially is going to have an adverse effect. It's an interesting question. And again, I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence drug discovery, but perhaps pushing the boundaries of discovering new compounds also means that we need to accept a little bit more, tox risk. How you address that, I don't entirely know, but this is something that AI companies have to wrestle with. Do we push the boundaries and accept some tox risk in exchange for possibly discovering a completely new, completely different chemical class against potentially a completely novel target? Interesting philosophical question. I'll leave it to the AI people to sort that out. In China, we've had a couple of webinars on China this past year. There's just a lot of innovation coming out of China. I think thinking of China as a place to do cheap drug discovery and cheap drug development, that's one way to think about it. But I think my guess is that the companies are probably not spending enough time scouting for really interesting drug candidates coming out of China. I have a colleague that works in China. We talk about this constantly. So if you're a company that's looking to tap into innovation coming out of China, let me know. Certainly happy to help you with that. So, what are some predictions for 2025 and the years to come? I say bet it all on black because I have no idea. Let me break this down into 4 categories. In terms of industry, business development, and licensing, I think a lot of the issues that we're dealing with cell and gene therapy, a lot of these things will just continue. Oncology licensing, oncology acquisitions, it's still going to be king. I don't have data here, but the amount of capital that went to oncology relative to other therapeutic areas, it's just incredible. 3 times, 4 times bigger, something like that. It's not even close, which has its challenges, which it's a topic for a separate discussion. But I think 2025 will be I think more of the same. Same amount of capital, fewer rounds of investment, therefore more capital per company, so fewer companies are going to be able to raise capital. Whether the IPO market's open next year, I'm not entirely convinced. We'll just have to wait and see. Geopolitics, in my view, we sort of have 3 simmering issues. These are not the only 3, obviously. I don't even begin to talk about some of the issues going on in Africa. look, I think the U.S. and Europe um, pharma industries are large enough that if these conflicts continue at their current level, we will probably be okay. Um, Obviously improvements in any of these would be great. Um, if anything, changes suddenly, if there are boots on the ground, for example, that's going to be problematic. That'll scare investors away from the broader markets and certainly scare people away from biotech. So, we'll see what the incoming administration can or can't do about these. I don't think tariffs are helpful. Um, I think we're still going to be, have a pro-Israel stance, and Ukraine. The incoming administration has said they can solve the problem. I personally have my doubts, but we'll just have to wait and see. So, what does the economy look like for next year? What does the biotech segment of the overall economy look like next year? It's incredibly unpredictable. Until we see what happens with these appointments, until we get more clarity on policy and so forth, we'll just have to wait and see. Ask me this question in June next year, we'll probably have a better sense of where the economy is going. So I think our industry, for the most part, we will be okay. Any potential changes like IRA and FDA budget cuts, those will take time. I don't think we'll have any major changes, certainly not for the first half of next year. Second half of the next year and then going into 2026 is, I think, when we'll begin to see some of these changes actually work their way through the ecosystem. And I haven't talked about this. Pharma is still sitting on a hell of a lot of cash. I suspect the boards of directors of these companies are also waiting to see what happens, especially in the second half of next year. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised if the first half of next year was a half a year that was not terribly transactive, but then maybe see things pick up in the second half of next year once things become a bit clearer. So that's about the end of our video here. If you're not familiar with us, Lacerta Bio, we've been in business since 2010. We're coming up on our 15th anniversary. Where does time fly? We focus on 3 areas. We help companies with their either in-licensing or out-licensing. We can run full or partial processes. We can also help you with various components of that process. We also help companies with in or out licensing strategy and tactics. We help you with your pipeline, your portfolio, help you understand what's licensable, what's not licensable, and so forth. And then we run a variety of training programs. We do live and pre-recorded video training programs. We also run custom training programs for people that are new to business development or new BD organizations. So if you're interested in any of our services, just feel free to reach out. Next year, we are planning on attending Bio in Boston in June, and we're also planning on attending Bio Europe in Vienna in November. We are tentatively scheduled, although not 100% certain, that we may be at Bio Europe Spring in Milan in March. We are planning to have a Lacerta Bio primer on the Sunday prior to all 3 of these events. I'll have to find an Irish bar in Milan. We'll have to get our people working on that. But I know the location of the Boston one. We will be in the same place we were a few years ago. Vienna, maybe we'll have to look into that. But if you are planning on being at these conferences, look for us in the partnering system. Follow us on LinkedIn, and you'll learn when the primer will take place. Again, the primer will be on the Sunday, usually about 6 p.m. local time, prior to the commencement of these conferences. So if you're watching and you'd like to meet, send us a meeting request. We'd love to meet. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for an interesting year. Hopefully you've had a very good year as well. We'd like to wish all of you a very safe, very happy, very prosperous 2025. And for our Spanish-speaking folks, gracias por un muy buen año. Les deseo a todos un felices y seguros vacaciones. Y nos vemos en el 2025. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.